Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us here in person and online, especially Naya, who's joining behind us. Hey, Naya. We are here today to talk about climate action and how young people are driving action. I'm Dominique. I'm the co-founder and outgoing executive director of Youth Climate Lab. You know, climate change is here, it's getting worse, and it's fundamentally a justice issue. Those most impacted have had the least to do to cause the problem. And among them are young people who are facing a very uncertain future, but are rising to the challenge. Youth Climate Lab, we are a global organization, and our programming builds skills for young people and accelerates their ideas, their policy ideas, their projects, and their businesses. And on the stage here and behind us are kick-ass young people who are part of our community and who are here to share their stories and their solutions. So let's kick it off. First question, who are you and how did you come to this work? And Naya, because you're joining us online, would love to start off with you.
Sure, yeah. Thanks for having me. My name is Naya. I'm currently living in Hamilton, Ontario in Canada for school, but I was born and raised in Vancouver, BC. I like climbing trees, I love stories, I'm a student, and I'm a climate justice organizer. So in high school, I got involved in the climate strikes, and I'm sure that many of you were at the climate strikes or heard about them, especially during the September 2019 sort of global week of action. And for us in Vancouver, that ended up being the largest protest in the city's history. And then, yeah, over the past few years, I've been part of a team across Canada, kind of reflecting on where the climate movement is currently at and designing some next steps for where we go from here. The climate strikes, I think, and so many of the devastating natural disasters that we've all lived through since have sort of made it clear, and everyone knows now that we're in a state of climate emergency. We all know that our governments need to take bold and urgent action, but it's really hard to know what that actually means. Back in Canada, we watch our government acknowledge the crisis and then turn around and give our tax dollars to buy a pipeline. And for me, I have no clue who to believe. Most of us in Canada can't even name a climate solution, and it's not our fault. But because of this, half of Canadians also say that they're aware of human-caused climate change, but don't believe that we can do anything about it. And 60% of young people in particular think that humanity is doomed because of this crisis. So a group of us have realized that highlighting the problem isn't enough anymore. We know we're living through these constant crises, but now we're looking to build the people power and the political power to win transformative solutions to the climate crisis, solutions that are also going to materially improve people's lives. So we're organizing a mass and multiracial movement of young people who know what it feels like to take collective action and who are going to use that knowledge to implement real solutions.
Amazing. Thank you, Naya. Great intro. This feels so uniquely 2022, this hybrid approach. So, and really, yeah, grateful for you to touch on how the doom is so present in how we're learning and talking about climate change in so many conversations, but really the solutions and what you folks are doing are just amazing. So let's continue. Joshua, tell us about who you are and how you got into this work.
Thank you, Dom, and very happy to be here. So my name is Joshua, I'm from Ghana, and I got into this space in 2013 when I was still a bachelor student studying environmental science. And universities have a very unique way that professors have solutions to every problem, but they won't do it. And they will tell you a lot about things that needs to be done, but we are all in a classroom. So that was the start of activism for me, that I could hear a lot of solutions, but the moment I get out of the classroom, I could see a lot of problems still. And asking my professor, so if you know all of these, why are we not doing it? And his response was, it's the role of the teacher to let us know as students what is possible, and it's our responsibility to act on it. So that was a very moving piece for me. So I got together with a couple of colleagues, and we said, okay, let's try to see if we can implement some of these within the communities. So we started as a student organizing group, going into communities. mostly around coastal conservation, because I schooled on the coast. And we did a lot of work around working with communities, and through that really learned even more than what we had in the classroom. Because whilst in the classroom we were made to believe that communities don't understand what is happening in a broader sense, they had their own time frame and time lapse that made them also react the way they did to certain issues like coastal erosion, to harvesting mangroves for food, and without even maybe even planting back, to different sort of waste pollution that were happening around the coast. And doing that really gave us a lot of insight that there has to be a way to bring theoretical knowledge from classroom, but also into sort of working with communities. So climate change, such a big topic, global topic, everyone wants to talk about this, but in local communities, this does not translate. It's really about what they can see today and tomorrow, and their everyday livelihood. If I wake up in the morning and I have to worry about getting money for my kid to go to school, believe me, I cannot imagine what will happen the next 50 years. I'm more worried about what will happen today and tomorrow to my child, and that is the most important thing. So that really moved us to look even deeper into the topic of climate change, and there the conversation of justice became a problem that has to be fixed, because while others could see it in a very broader perspective, very long term, we need to take action, others were forced to look at it in a very short term as a mode of survival and do whatever they need to do to survive. And the core part of that was, how do we, as young people, work to be the intersection between what people see, or experts see in this case, from a book knowledge, to what communities actually feel on an everyday basis. So we set up an organization out of this called Green Africa Youth Organization, and we work directly with communities. And we have a gender balanced team, keeping the team very diverse as possible, and keeping that inspiration of, even though we think we know as people who have been through formal education, realizing that we still don't know, because those who really live in the reality are the ones who understand it better, and working together with communities to fight climate change. So that is how I got into this, and since then I've been working international in many different spaces, and always realizing that we still have the wrong approach to solving the climate crisis. Yeah.
Love that. We need action now. We need to meet people where they're at. And Larissa, what about you? Tell us about how you got started in this work and a little bit of who you are.
Yes, danse Larissa Crawford Dishane Caution, Calgary New Weekend, Pimi Famille, Penitangwe, Shimpi, Jamaica New Weekend. Bonjour, je m'appelle Larissa Crawford. J'ai une ascendance métisse de Penitangwe and ascendance afro-caribbean de Jamaïque. Hey, I'm Larissa. I am from Calgary, Alberta. Alberta is pretty much the Texas of Canada, so I feel very at home here. I carry Métis ancestry from Penetang, Ontario, and Afro-Caribbean ancestry from Jamaica. Pass this on to my 5-year-old daughter, Zaira. And I'm really excited to be here to share space with y'all. I mean, my entire existence has really brought me here. I do carry the lived experiences that contribute to the qualification that, for doing this work. I am Afro-Indigenous. I've navigated racism my entire life. I carry several disabilities and am recovering from a brain bleed, and so navigating barriers with regards to ableism. I grew up in extreme poverty without access to water, and heat at times. And I bring this forward in my work. So I grew up on the land. I definitely have always had a deep connection to land, and it was in my university pursuits, and it's actually in one of my first tastes of like the real world outside of university, while working at a Ministry of Energy in Canada, that I really came to appreciate the need for anti-racism work in environmental spaces. And so a lot of my work focuses on that intersection. I've been doing Indigenous and anti-racism research and policy advising for over 13 years, so most of my life. I'm 27. And I really am passionate about bringing and using the skills I have in my language and in the way I can present information, remaining connected with community, and then bringing those voices, bringing those needs into spaces that can actually implement the action necessary. So I do very much see my work as doing that. I also have background in restorative conflict resolution, which many of us aren't great listeners. A lot of us don't have great communication skills because we're not explicitly taught them. And so I'm really passionate too about using conflict resolution as a way to bring people together, especially in cross-cultural contexts. Now, I'm the founder and managing director of Future Ancestors Services. We're a small youth-led professional services social enterprise. My entire team is Black, Indigenous, or racialized. Almost all of us are disabled, and the majority are queer. And it's quite fascinating to go in the spaces that we do. We work with every federal ministry in Canada. We work with the UN. We work with several offices in the US, actually, nonprofits, corporations. We go into these spaces where we're traditionally looked at and undervalued or devalued because of our age, because of our identities. So we go into these spaces with decolonial and indigenized practices and ways of doing business, and we assert ourselves as carrying value in those spaces. And so, yeah, that's the gist of what we do. I'm going to speak more about kind of what we do as we go through the questions, but you can learn more about what we do at Ancestors Future on Instagram, on Twitter. But yeah, I don't want to take up too much more time. I want to get into the dialogue.
Yeah, let's get into the dialogue. Well, I think in all of what's so unique about your stories and your experiences is very much centering your experiences as young people, your lived experiences. And so with that, based on those experiences, what's the difference between climate action and climate justice? Naya, we'll start with you.
Sure. Yeah, I guess to put it as simply as possible, for me, climate justice speaks to people and climate action doesn't. We're living through like so many crises right now, and I think it's okay to be overwhelmed, but it's also okay to not know what to think about it all. But the important thing to remember is that climate justice is like the way of meeting us where we're at, and focusing on climate change, I think, like Joshua said, in the context of our own lives and our own struggles. Climate justice organizing has kind of taught me that throughout history, there have been groups of selfish people who've had power and who've tried to better themselves at the expense of everyone else. And right now, there's a group of people who's trying to make us feel separate from the land, feel separate from each other, from people who are different ages and different races and different classes than us. And those are the people who are responsible for climate change. But organizing has also, I guess, just taught me that all throughout history, there have been everyday people fighting for their humanity. And so climate action is like about what you can do as one person through like plastic straws and driving less and thrifting. And that small group of people wants us to sort of resign ourselves to those types of actions, to not being good enough at climate action, to feel like powerless and guilty for contributing to a problem when we didn't even cause it in the first place. And also, I think, to be suspicious of people who are different from us and to think about ourselves first. But for me, climate justice means solidarity. When that small group of people who is responsible for most of this crisis are trying their very best to divide us, the best thing that we can all do is to come together. And so I guess climate action through climate justice makes me feel less alone in the world, but it's also the only way that we're going to win.
Love that, Naya. That was beautiful. Snaps in the room. I don't think you can see us, but Larissa, what about you?
Yeah, no. The way I like to think about this is that it's not one versus the other, but it's one and the other. And we first have to acknowledge that climate change is a symptom deriving from root causes. And when we acknowledge that it is a symptom, then we can redirect actually our attention towards the root problem. So it's like diversity and inclusion versus anti-racism. Diversity and inclusion, maybe we see a lack of diversity and we put in a couple quotas to bring on more Black, Indigenous people. But that often causes harm because we aren't asking, well, why do we need to do this in the first place? Are we actually attracting Black and Indigenous people, or are we not retaining them? Why are we not retaining them? What relationship do we have to these communities that is creating this dominance of whiteness in the space? We don't ask that question when we only use a tool. With anti-racism, we're required to explore the root causes. Why do we need to do this work in the first place? What context are we bringing them within? What context and ecosystem are we not considering as they come to our spaces? And so for me, climate action is really the tool that we use within climate justice. Yes, we need climate action, but we need to do it in a holistic historical context. One really quick example, Kluane National Park in Yukon. It was created as a game reserve in 1948. And so all the indigenous peoples from this land were very violently removed from the land. And they had been on this land and caring for this land for time immemorial. And this removal of indigenous peoples was part of an climate action project by the Canadian government to preserve and conserve the natural world. Now, this was done on an assumption that humans are separate from a natural ecosystem. And what ended up happening was not only severe intergenerational harm to these indigenous peoples, but we also saw, in the absence of necessity-based hunting, an overpopulation of wolves that completely rearranged and disturbed that natural ecosystem. And so climate action without the social, political, historical context ended up causing more harm to the environment and to people. But if we take into consideration those historical, social contexts, if we had listened to indigenous peoples, their traditional teachings, then we would have avoided that harm caused. And so for me, climate action is very much necessary, but within the context of climate justice, where we are taking those social, political, historical circumstances and considerations into how we now apply the tool, but not situating the tool as the kind of means of success or the end of success.
Yeah, and action can look so different, but it needs to be grounded in justice. Yeah. Josh, what about you?
I think the question is already answered, actually. There's little I can add at this point. I was just thinking of what Naya said, what you said. I think climate action takes a system perspective, and climate justice takes a unit perspective within the system. So, and I will give an example. If there's going to be a flood in a city, you're looking at, let's protect the critical assets. So you want to protect your telecommunication, you want to protect your bank reserve, you want to protect all these things. Who are these systems serving? They're the privileged already, right? Those who live in the slum, they can get flooded, that is fine, because we cannot let the bank flood, we cannot let the telecommunication system flood. So you want to protect all these things. So you channel the water towards the area where you have less cost, right? So that is action still, but that is very unjust. So for me, it's really, when I think of climate action, we could do a lot on climate action, and we've done a lot. And that's why I said in the beginning that we still got it wrong. Because we're trying to take action. We say, okay, let's all switch to renewables. Okay, EVs. Well, I mean, how many people can drive EVs in my country? How many people can drive EVs across the whole continent of Africa, South Asia? I don't know. So if you invest so much in EV, yes, we are taking action. Is that just? I don't know. If we take it along, even if you take it in the context of, say, jobs, right? And that's something I'm very, very particular about. Climate action. We get a lot of international consultants flying in every day, designing projects, designing whatever for all these global south countries. And these are funding given by governments sort of across Europe, across the US and Canada, given to many of these countries, and they pay that money back into consultancies for folks to fly into design strategies. I mean, come on. We're just kidding ourselves. So we can take a lot of action, great, but we won't solve the problem. We will keep making it difficult for the one who is already facing the brunt of climate change. We keep making it worse for them, because in the end, we're just making it easier for the one who is already privileged. And for me, this is how I see action and justice. We need both. It's like mitigation and adaptation. When the climate conversation started, it was very clear. We need to reduce emissions. Now, how many years now? Did we reduce anything? Are people still flooding? Yeah. Are we still seeing the heat waves? Yes. Are we still seeing the wildfires? Yes. Do we still talk about mitigation? Yes. Why? Because it protects the privileged again. So we can take action, but if you really want to solve the problem, we need to take it from a justice perspective. People who are really in the heat of the moment need to be skilled and need to be supported for them to get to a level where we can have a common narrative on how we're going to tackle the problem. But as long as we want to take it from the angle of whoever has the power and has the privilege to say this is the direction to go, and this cuts across everything. It cuts across IPCC report. It cuts across any document we've read saying we have 10 years. We don't have 10 years. Bangladesh doesn't have 10 years. I mean, come on. We don't have 10 years. These are things that is taken from a system perspective. Okay, as a planet, we have 10 years. Does Somalia has 10 years? No. So if you want to be just, this is how we need to look at it. Unit perspective, bring that into consideration before we consider a system perspective. Yeah.
And I think you're pointing to sort of how big the problem is, but how it exasperates and multiplies the current injustices. And you folks are young people who are working, within this big context, within this big systems. I would love to learn more about how you see your role within this space and how you are seeing other youth show up for climate action. Larissa, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I love this question because I think we do play a really unique role. We have to do things differently, and a lot of people are starting to recognize that. And it's really important that we're bringing in these new worldviews, perspectives, and I think that's really where we see the value in collaborating with younger generations. So at Future Ancestor Services, we're all youth. And it's really exciting to kind of see how we're breaking away from the traditional ways that we should set up a consulting firm. For example, we center our relationship to land and how we operate. So we actually work with the seasons. We work differently as the year goes by. Capitalism has really indoctrinated us to think that we have to work with the same energy, doing the same kind of work all year round. And that's not how my ancestors existed. That happened after colonial contact. And so youth are thinking like this. Our generations are not only thinking like this, but are developing our skills to be able to articulate this, to shift and push those systems. I've been in panel situations where I've literally had the moderator try to take my mic away because I was really pushing them. We push the marks, and I don't know, I really appreciate that about our generations. We are also we were educated under a different education system. And so there are valuable aspects that we see from previous education systems, and there are valuable aspects of the education systems we've been brought under. And the most effective youth that I'm seeing in their climate action and climate justice pursuits are the ones that are recognizing that we can't just do this alone. We can't be excluding our elders. We can't be writing off people who've done this work for 30 years. They have valuable knowledge too. And the most effective groups that I'm seeing are the ones who acknowledge that in the way that they pursue climate justice. And bring in children as well to our spaces. I often have my 5-year-old daughter in my space. We often signal it's a child caregiver-friendly space. And it's amazing to see how that actually shifts the tone, because now we have a very visual signal of the work that we're doing is for this generation. It's for their next generations. And so it brings a personal aspect to our work, I think, that is often missing when we think about too much about sustainability, strategic planning, and projects. And then in terms of what I'm seeing as well, I do want to be a bit critical. Capitalism has shaped the way that we operate, the way that we do business, the way that we think about activism, especially in non-governmental organizations. We're taught to compete for scraps of funding, and in competing for that scraps of funding, we're taking away from other organizations. We're duplicating services. People are starting things just to say they started it. And we're seeing so much climate action led by ego and by the commodification of climate influence and climate action. And that's concerning to me, just because I think we're seeing in a lot of ways how we are contributing now to the harm that we're supposedly trying to address. And that gets to the root of the issues. So I think we really need to be critical about how we're doing climate action as well. At Future Ancestors Services, we have it in our mission that we do not compete with other services doing our work, because our goal is to contribute to more sustainable, more just societies, futures for diverse people, non-human kin, and Earth. And we can't be competing. We need to be acknowledging kind of the ways that we can collaborate and the way that we can move towards these values and these futures in a cohesive and collaborative way. And again, capitalism and seeing the way that it influences, especially young minds, especially young activist spaces, it is concerning. And I really encourage other climate activists to call people in when you see that happen, and to really be critical about what are you signaling to other young people about what climate action is, and really how you're contributing to that idea of climate justice.
Yeah, love that. And how do we move away from competition towards collaboration, towards working together to build the just and climate resilient futures that we all deserve? I'd be curious, Josh, what you think of how do we move towards that more collaboration, and maybe also what barriers may exist to prevent that.
Thanks a lot. I'll pick it up from what Larissa said. I think it's a question of what is your unique role in the space that you're functioning in, and most often there's none. I mean, there's not so much. You have to work to support something. But here's the thing, and I say that many people would want to be the founder of a company with 2 people than to be the chief finance officer for a company with 100 employees or a company with whatever impact. We've come to a generation where there's so much in titles. There's so much in titles, and that forms part of our identity. And it's there, and I work with a lot of young people across the world, and it's there. Everyone wants to start to introduce themselves by their title, before function, and that is it. I mean, they better say a title with no impact, and that is completely fine. So that has just created this culture. So to go around that and to create another space that really exists, from my perspective, is really identifying how could I make someone, and this is how I do it with the work that I do across the globe, is how do I make that young person still feel valuable, because that value is attached to a title. So I give you whatever title that you feel comfortable with, but then later translate that into impact and function. And that is a journey, and it takes time to be able to build it across that time. But again, if you have 10 people in a room who are all thinking from this direction, believe me, it's really tough. Because in that person's mind, that title is more important and puts him at a higher rank than the other person. And it doesn't matter the function, it's just the title. It doesn't even matter what they're actually going to do. So that is a problem that exists. And here I see the role of our elders in helping us fix this. Because that is how we fix this in my organization and some of the movement that I work in, by having traditional organizations which we don't like. We hate it. We have our issues against as a younger generation. But when we sit with them, they're able to really clearly talk about, don't forget about the title. This is what you do. And this is why you are here. Putting focus in that and not the title per se, but really rooting you in that. And it's also like when you have two kids at home. And the other one has a birthday probably in January, the other one has it in August. And when it's January and the other one gets the gifts, the one who has their birthday in August is there like, And of course, you might as well just give the other kid something as well and keep everyone happy. And in August, you do the same thing for both of them, right? But it's also part of that responsibility. It's also training whoever at whatever date to realize that this moment is for this. And we cannot have it all of them at the same time. And mostly, our homes, we've missed this. So everyone wants to get whatever they want at the same time and whenever they want it. So if this activist has 500 followers on Instagram, then the next month is the other person's goal to get the same. What is that going to do? I mean, right? So we forget the reason why we even do what we do, the reason why we started the work in the first place, and we just end up chasing titles and being very, very competitive. So here the responsibility is A, calling it out, B, really seeking advice. And this will be, whoever is watching this live stream and joining us as a young activist, really seeking advice, we've come to a generation where everyone has an opinion. Everyone is an expert of this topic all of a sudden. I mean, come on. It cannot work. If the IPC say this, this person believes that. We need to stop fossil fuel now. Believe me, it cannot stop now, because if it stops now, whoever is asking for that, your life will be miserable. You cannot stay in Europe and stay in Canada or US and think that we stop it all today and you'll be comfortable. You cannot even live. You cannot assist. Can you imagine your life without that? It's not possible. Understanding the process, learning, taking time to understand the system you even live in and the system that you operate within is most important to solve it and to have any influence. But everyone wake up the next morning and think they know enough because you can read the headline and not read the rest of the text, and you feel like you've gotten all the message and you want to have influence. So for me, this is really an advice to the movement. The most effective climate activists I've seen are the ones who have 0 followers, probably doesn't even have any public profiling. But when I go to the climate events and climate conferences, they are the ones who take their time to sit, really draft the statements, the next morning put it on the table at the decision-making table. But the media wants to capture all the people outside who hold placards. I mean, I don't get it. If the system has created a space for us to sit and dialogue and for young people to have influence, why neglect that table and stand outside and hold a placard? We can do all of that all year long. But when the moment comes for us to be in the room and have a conversation, let's go sit down and talk. That is not a time to go and hold placards outside, because that is when the policies are being drafted. So really, we've missed our priorities, and we need to think about it effectively. Why do we do what we do? If we want to influence policy, we need to know the time for that. If we want to raise awareness, there's a time for that. If you want to challenge the current system, there's a time for that. But let's not mix it up and do it all together anytime you want, simply because it's nice and attractive and fancy.
And does it speak to also just maybe the lack of models for how folks who are working on the inside, as well as those who are working on the outside, can collaborate and connect? Because there is, when we talk about urgency and the systems that we work with, within the big, Paris Agreement, policy spaces, those move really slow. Those move so slow. And to learn the process is also like, how many COPs have we been to? Like, too many for and it's really hard to understand. And so there is a need for the outside to be pushing those systems. But I wonder, is it also because we just don't have those models of collaboration, or we don't see enough of that? And then this other question, and Larissa, you spoke to this a little bit about your business model, but I think as young people who come into spaces, whether it's policy spaces or even out in the streets, there's a lot of that sort of youth discount that's applied. There's a devaluation of like, oh, that's really cute, keep doing what you're doing. And so I wonder also how those forces are impacting how we work together. Because, we have to constantly say, hey, I'm this, I am the founder of this, because for a lot of people, that's how they say, oh, you're relevant to this conversation. Naya, I wonder what you think of all of this. Lot to go off.
Yeah, I think I can touch a little bit just on the originality of young people in climate spaces. I guess like most of the climate spaces I've been in have been full of young people, and usually run by young people too, which is like a really cool and specific, but also exciting experience, and kind of just like a sense of feeling united as a generation is very cool. But yeah, I guess like over the past 40 or so years, like our understanding of what is possible, like in politics or like at COPs or anything like that, has been drastically changed. And so things that we might used to consider common sense have like completely disappeared before our eyes. And we've just seen like budget cuts and like climate action doesn't make sense and companies providing services. But I guess like one of the things that I love most about young people, to be honest, is that we know that our governments exist to serve us, and we know that we deserve better. And I'm hearing that even just in how like you three are talking right now. We've never known anything different, but we're still able to see that something better is possible. And we do want it to be the new common sense, and we're willing to put in the work to build that new common sense. I think a lot of us are scared and angry about the climate crisis, but because of this, we also aren't stuck in the status quo, and so we're willing to do what's necessary, and we feel that sense of purpose and that sense of hope. But I guess I would say, like, at the same time, we can't stop at big visions. We do need the know-how and the material resources to make them happen. And so there is like a place for every generation. Younger people don't always have like the leverage, the economic power to back us up. And that's why we need older folks who are on our side as well. Yeah, and then I think the other thing that just struck me as everyone else was talking was, I think one of the biggest barriers, especially for young people, is like the despair that a lot of us feel. It can be really incredibly demoralizing to go to COPs and to just like protest or be in spaces where your voice is discounted. I think we all have experiences with that. But I'm holding on to and sitting with something that one of my co-organizers, Gabrielle Gelderman, who does work around climate grief, has said to me, that climate organizing is the practice of seeing things as they really are. I think like most of us are used to sort of going about our lives, doing our silly little tasks, going the wheel, and not really listening to our feelings, and what the world around us and what both of those things are telling us. I mean, I do it all the time. And so it makes sense that like as young people who are experiencing like many intersecting crises, we don't want to choose to tap into those feelings. We don't want to immerse ourselves into a crisis when we can just try and ignore it. But the reality is also like a lot of us don't have that option. And at the same time, feeling despair doesn't mean that we have to like resign ourselves to things never changing. Accepting despair is like a way of letting us see reality as it really is so that we can actually meet it and change it. And so I think most young people and most of us probably in this room or this virtual room know how serious this crisis is. But seriousness should only strengthen our resolve. We've done huge and hard things before in history. We do them every day in our lives. Why do we suddenly believe that all is lost just this time? And this is especially important, I think, for young people in the global north, because I think in some ways it's the easiest for us to dismiss those who came before us, dismiss people who are being impacted right now, and dismiss our feelings. But we owe it to ourselves to feel our emotions. We owe it to people around the world who are being hurt right now, to connect with elders, to learn about the lineage of changemakers that we come from, and to let all of this give us a sense of purpose, and then to be able to come together and meet the challenge of the moment that we're in.
Yes, love that. And I think also something else, and Larissa, I want to point to you and also echo something Maria Alejandra said yesterday during the climate justice session, was just also this, you know, these emotions, this grief, but also this burnout. So many young people are burnt out doing this work. So wondering, Larissa, if you can comment on that.
Yeah, no, we definitely saw that. Future Ancestor Services has been operating since April 2020. We launched at the onset of the pandemic. And for the past 2 years, we've been really critical, not just about our work outputs, but about how we do our work. And I think it's a question that's not asked in sustainability spaces enough, especially youth sustainability spaces. How are we working together? So for example, the idea of titles. We thought about that. We talked to our elders, and now we have alchemists and directors. And we are using, actually, I'm really excited about it, but we're using queer theory as a way to re-examine and re-explore what is this idea of power, not as control, I have control over you, but actually I have responsibility to you and your well-being and your success in this organization. That reframing has addressed so much harm that we've experienced in Western colonial institutions and is actually allowing us to do this work in a healthy way. Bringing in trauma therapists for trauma therapy sessions with our team, having different amounts of money where we can support people financially when we go through trauma. These are ways that I'm seeing our organization and other youth-led organizations, especially Indigenous and Black-led organizations in what is currently Canada, are leading with these teachings that we're getting from community, that we're getting from our elders. And it's something that any organization can go back home and do today. Really critically look at, well, how are we talking about power in this organization? How are we creating space for everyone to identify the way they need to be respected in this space? That too ends up being a really big barrier, because most spaces I go into, I'm not respected by default. And so I need space, I need to create space for myself to articulate in the ways in which I need to be respected differently than maybe any of you. And so being critical about how we're doing our work as well as those work outputs is really key. And I just want to add on to, you had mentioned like the discounting of youth voices. And we saw that at TED in Edinburgh, and I'm just going to be straight up. We saw a lot of older white men go on stage, use the language of activists, and then say, we need these people to actually do something now. We don't need these protests. We need action. Yet they're coming in co-opting activist language. I know for a fact none of them would be on stage saying the things they were saying if it was not for the success and the scholars that are leading those grassroots organizations and movement. I can do my work because there is that social pressure, because there's an acknowledgement that this is a new standard, a minimum standard, and we're going to come in and help. And so, yeah, I just want to note that too, to be conscious of that, to be conscious of making sure we're attributing kind of who's creating space for us to actually come in and do sustainability work, and give people their props and acknowledge their action as valuable. And so, yeah, I'll stop there. I've been talking for a while, but.
Oh, love it. Keep talking. It's great. Josh, I want to hear from you. You're someone who is, works directly with communities, but also at the highest levels of decision making, at the big COP spaces, at global climate adaptation forums. How do you have any advice really for young people, or maybe about your approach on how you navigate those spaces with everything that's being said so far?
Okay. First of all, I think learning doesn't stop, and I didn't really feel that a lot of young people stopped learning the moment they got the attention. And so the learning paused just when they got the attention. So most of the things they are advocate for say, it's, again, just very not what the present is looking at. So many a times you have a meeting where the focus is, say, resilience, and you invite a young person to come and share input. They come into the room and all they want to talk about is transition to solar energy, for instance. I mean, great, it's important, but that is not the room for that, right? And the second part is acknowledging that not every space is meant for you. So if you really want to do renewable energy and you get invited to talk about resilience, I mean, sorry, but this is not me. I have a recommendation for someone else who could do that better, because that is not you. Yeah. But you hurt the movement the moment you take that space and go and say something that doesn't belong there because they cannot use it. And that really hurts me a lot on a personal level, because there are so many brilliant young people I meet every day who wants that opportunity. And they won't get it because it's been held by those who might not have the knowledge to even be in that room. So really, big plead. If you get the spot and you know that this is not your story to tell, let someone else tell the story, because that is what supports the movement as a whole. That's very important. The third thing I'll mention is that, personally, I don't see climate justice without professional development for those who really need to communicate their stories. And you won't believe how many times I've come across young people who are proposed for a panel, and the answer will be no, because there's no record of them speaking publicly. So organizers are not going to bet on that, right? Yeah. They got to see, have they spoken somewhere before? How good is that? Can we trust that they're going to be fit for that panel? So we would end up going to the few folks that we know already, who we've heard them say whatever they want to say already, and we're going to limit the folks who are really have a unique story to tell that will touch hearts and really make things move. So part of my journey was that, when I got into the youth space and climate at the beginning, the whole thing was, how do I make this professional? Because at the end of the day, folks are going to engage me if I'm acting professionally, and this is my profession, than if I'm just, because it's nice and I'm just doing it. Because I might not have the same advantage as someone else. So I went into, okay, I'm going to further my studies on this topic. I'm going to strive to do publications around this topic. I'm going to act more professionally, and if there are spaces where I'm getting invited and I don't see it strategically as a space that really brings much, I'm not going to take that. I'm going to focus my energy on what brings results. So I became quite result-oriented, and also mapping out what makes the most sense to me. So if research is your angle, then just focus on that. if media is your angle, just focus on that. If yours is just grassroots work, and focus on that, because like we said at the beginning, the unique roles is very important, but there's not going to be any unique role anymore if you're all doing a bunch of different things at the same time. Then it doesn't work. So we need someone who is just going to focus on law and climate for young people. We're going to need someone who focuses on indigenous knowledge and climate for young people. But we can all not be experts of everything at the same time, really. It doesn't help and it doesn't work. And then the last thing I'll talk about is what we're doing now with Green Africa Youth Organization. So we're setting up youth climate councils. And the idea of that is that there's always going to be people who will be privileged than others. We've accepted that. There's always going to be people who will be at a higher advantage on getting access to resources than others. So how do we make sure that those who have that advantage can still work in the interest of those who don't? So we're creating youth climate councils with the concept of resource solidarity, accessibility solidarity. So if at a national level in Ghana, there are organizations who are really in touch with the ministry, they will get invited to any policy review. They will be in the city itself, so it's like 30 minutes drive there in the room, they can make input. But that cuts out everyone else who is like living 5 hours away, it doesn't have the contact. And we're working with all these key folks that when they get those invitations, they can bring someone else along. And they can bring more people into the room, and we provide the funding for the transportation, accommodation, whatever, for new voices to be in the room so that they can build their own relationship with the stakeholders. We're doing the same with accessibility to COP, for instance. You know, the climate conference, everyone wants to go. I mean, I get it. It's a crazy space. But many people also go and realize that, oh, I don't like this. It's just too much talking and no action or whatever. And many people realize, oh, this is not my thing. I'm more into entrepreneurship and not more into policy. So we're taking our time to, again, train people, understand their roles, and see where they might fit best. You know, there are many folks I feel like this place, you know, like Austin, this big festival is more their thing. And if you put such a person into a climate policy conference, they might get lost. So how do we direct those folks to such spaces and finance them to be able to be in the right place to get the resources they need? And I see this concept of youth climate councils very, very important and powerful, because in the end, no one has all the experiences to fix this crisis that we are living in. We need diverse voices, and we need to view all those voices on an equal level. And that means that the one who has resources but might not have the experience, that is great. Let's support the one with the experience to also have resources to be on the same level. So these are a few things I would say as how we can move forward. And I guess the key message here is really focus on what makes the most sense to you. And as an African, as Ghanaian, as a young farmer myself, for me, adaptation, for instance, is the most important thing. Tell me whatever, I will tell you we need to adapt today. Let's reduce emission, great. That is someone else's message and advocacy, I don't care. But for me, we need communities to be able to survive the floods, to survive the heat waves, to survive the impact that is happening, because that makes the most sense to me. If the whole world should switch to EVs or whatever, it doesn't stop the flood from next year. It doesn't stop the drought from next year, and that is what I'm concerned about. But I can understand if someone, I don't know, in Germany, for instance, don't get this narrative. And I want that person to advocate on, you know, let's transition energy right away. Because in their perspective, that is the most important thing. So really look at what makes the most sense to you from where you are, from your perspective. Stick with that narrative, advocate for it, get it done. And if we all do the same thing in the different spaces we are, you know, it's going to be a beautiful activism and action across the world. Yeah.
I mean, and also what we're sharing here is applicable to everyone, right? Lean into what your interests, lean into your emotions, lean into what you're good at, lean into what sparks joy for you. I have a ton of other questions, but we are actually running out of time, and we want to make space for your questions too. So if you have questions, I think we have a mic at the back. Maybe just line up behind the mic, and we'll keep chatting until.
Questions.
Oh,
Nice.
Come on up.
Love it. Thank you. Okay, I'm not this tall, but I'll. Thank you all so much for speaking and sharing your wisdom. And a question for you, Joshua, based on what you were saying about it's not feasible or it's not realistic if we were to simply stop using fossil fuels today, like we wouldn't have all this, you know. But I'm wondering, I'm a divestment activist. I'm wondering, how do we portray and the immediacy, the urgency of this without using, because oil and gas proponents, they use our arguments and our call on divestment, immediate divestment, as a, in their toolkit as, oh, these youth activists are unrealistic. I understand, like, I have a degree in sustainability. I understand that it's not possible, but how do we communicate that we need this and we need it immediately without falling into that? Yeah, that's my question. Thank you all again.
Quick response?
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe, quick response, and then we'll take the others.
Cool. Quick response. I mean, that is completely fine as long as you understand what the reality is. Because my thing is that you need to know what is the minimum realistic feasibility to any cause. If not, you're just advocating for the wrong thing. So if you know, and I was surprised when I saw that EasyJet and some of these airline companies are doing substantive research around sustainable jet fuel, but their timeline is like 2040, 2050, so far away. And no one is talking about that. How do we get them to bring it a little bit forward? By looking at the data that is available and working more realistically. So the advocacy, yes, great. We need to really like transition ASAP. But blindly saying that without knowing what goes on behind that is very, very important. And that is my input. I mean, how many pension insurances are investing their money into fossil fuel? And they can easily move the money away because it's pension money anyways. I mean, and again, 50 years from now, we're going to be the ones who are getting into pension. Is that how we want to have our money? No. So how do we look at the data and advocate from a much more strategic perspective than plainly just saying, and fossil fuels now, without having the background to how we actually going to make it possible the earliest possible time? And quick one, from my experience as well, the sort of denial, companies, corporate, whatever, they are more easy to shift their mindset when they know that you know their stuff as well than when you don't know. Because when you don't know, they use that as to their advantage. Or you have no idea what is going on in that boardroom. Or did you read the latest report on this and that? You know it's not possible. But if you go in, then you know exactly what they also know in terms of what the actual data says. That, within 5 years, it might not be possible, but if we work very well, within 6 years, we could switch. That could be a possibility.
Okay, we'll take a few questions, and then we'll open it up for the panelists to respond.
Hi there, Hillary Heath with the Climate Justice Resilience Fund. I have appreciated this conversation, and I was struck by this notion of collaboration over competition. And I acknowledge that philanthropy has contributed to this culture of competition. And so I would love to hear what can philanthropy do to foster this environment of collaboration and not perpetuate competition. Thank you.
Great question. We'll take the others, and then we'll close off.
Thank you so much for your talk. So I work on a climate change education game for kids called Climate Detectives. Something I found while I was building the game is that there is not just a huge focus on whiteness in the climate space. There is also a large focus on people who live in cities, on urban populations. When we look at how climate change is impacting people who live in America, we see it most often happen in the Deep South. So the town of Duplin County in North Carolina, pig waste flooded the water during Hurricane Florence, and I don't think it's been fixed yet. In Duck Hill, Mississippi, Main Street was flooded and is now a river. We see, and there are just so many examples. I mean, in Selma and Montgomery, thousands of homes were flooded and destroyed during, I'm sorry, there are so many examples. How do you address this in your space, and why do you think rural learners and rural students and people are never brought into these conversations?
Yeah, one more question.
And one more. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Firstly, I just really appreciate these spaces of transnational solidarity and political youth making. I have two questions. One is, what's your take on nonviolence, direct action, and civil disobedience? I'm really curious to hear your experiences on that. And attached to that question, how do you see the climate justice movement going towards, where do you want it to go, basically? What's your wish for the movement? Thank you.
Great question. Okay, one more question.
Sorry, guys. I come from Cleveland, and my question is kind of, the youth movement is in the forefront of Web3 and using DAOs. decentralized autonomous organizations where it's a collaborative effort where everybody puts in money and it kind of decentralizes one entity like the IMF or a governmental organization to hold all the power. So what can we do as young people to start DAOs? And if our voices are not heard, and money is the currency of power in this generation. So how can we use DAOs and things older generations do not understand to give our voices now power in a way they do understand? Because this, this older generation, power, it's money, and money is power, and you can't separate them.
Yeah.
And until we come into power in a governmental level or, the future, I think we can use that, and young people are the ones designing Web3 and all of these things.
Yeah. Great questions. So many great questions. Maybe we can start with Naya, respond to one or a few of those questions, and we'll make our rounds back.
Oh man, trying to keep track of all of them. But yeah, thanks everyone for asking such great questions. I'm happy to take the question about NVDA and civil disobedience. I guess, I come from an organizing background that works within sort of trying to change dominant institutions. And so I am definitely a proponent of NVDA. I've participated in direct action before. But I think one of the biggest things I've learned, and maybe one of the things that Joshua touched on earlier, is that there's a spectrum of different ways to make change. So there's personal transformation, sort of taking individual centered actions, and then there's changing dominant institutions, which is what I definitely gravitate towards, and also creating alternatives as well and building those solutions out. And so I think there's definitely value in NVDA and in civil disobedience, especially just in terms of the way that we currently understand power in our society, and then the ways that young people can affect that. And I think that also has to be backed up with many different other theories of change as well. And so, value in NVDA and in grassroots movements, especially when it's people on the front lines who are doing that work, and then also follow it up with other things as well.
Larissa?
Yeah, I'm gonna first tackle the philanthropy one, just because we work a lot with foundations and with actually the recipients of that funding as well. We work a lot with NGOs who receive and charities who receive that funding. Two of our biggest observations has been changing how you work in the foundation, because we've seen so much harm with regards to on the recipient end because of the ways that a foundation operates, by centering kind of Western understanding of success and success criteria isn't allowing a lot of the recipients to honor more traditional, non-Western, non-colonial ways of evaluating success with regards to how they use the funding. And then creating funding opportunities that require collaboration, that require organizations to identify other partner organizations or groups to work with in implementing or acting on the funding. So those are two really quick points. In terms of the urban population, this is such an issue, especially when we even think of the southern-northern divide. In what is currently Canada, northern communities and perspectives are often excluded from the conversations, but we're seeing the most dramatic impacts of climate change in those northern contexts, especially in what is currently Canada. And so with regards to kind of how we're tackling that, this is why at Future Ancestors Services, we work in government, we work at the highest levels of power in our nation, and we really support them in acting on this idea of changing the way they do policy, changing the way they think about success, how they engage with communities, because so much of the barriers that we see systemically created through policy starts with the ignorance and internalized racism of the people actually creating or evaluating that. And so that is a really key piece, but bringing in those northern perspectives and understanding a responsibility to connect to those communities, to listen to what protesters are saying, to listen to what community activists are saying and community leaders, and then recognizing and understanding, at least for us, our role in actually implementing that. And then finally, just with the DOA, I just want to, I can't speak too much to this. DAO, sorry. My brain injury has me switching letters all the time. But what I've found to be very empowering is finding a way to bring in income where you're not dependent on funding, government funding, on foundation funding, and then charging your worth. I think it's very hard for young people to say, you know what, this service is worth $4,000, and to actually assert that. And so with regards to the DAOs, finding those opportunities to bring in income and making sure you're charging your worth.
And we are at time, but maybe you have a quick response to one of the questions, Joshua.
Okay, I think that'll tackle the one which about where we want to see the movement go. Yeah. So quick one, I think we need one collaborative force, one goal, unique rules. We aim at it, we do it, we get results. That's all.
Amazing. Thank you all for joining us today. The conversation hopefully continues. Come talk to us. We are also hosting a brunch and brews that is beginning now. If you haven't signed up, come talk to me because we may have a few tickets available. But come talk to me if you haven't signed up yet. So thank you all.